Keir Starmer, on Monday, got up in front of the press and announced a new immigration white paper. Now, I was old enough to remember when Keir Starmer wrote all of this off as jumping on a far-right bandwagon or peddling in the ideas of racism and division. In fact, in 1988, in an immigration law paper, he wrote that all immigration law is undergirded by racism. So, excuse me if I don't think he believes this, and actually it's just his record unpopularity which is causing him to take this expedient political measure. That and Tony Blair constantly ringing his phone red, saying, Keir, get a handle on this. You're completely scuppering the opportunity that I gave to you. But anyway, he got up in front of the press and announced a number of measures which, ostensibly, will crack down on both legal and illegal migration. He posted on X shortly before making the announcement that the Tories ran an immigration system that relied on cheap foreign labour instead of investing in British workers. That betrayal ends now. Now, that came about a week after he negotiated a trade deal with India that is meant to add £4.8 billion to the UK economy. Now, that's actually 0.168% of GDP growth every year. And that is at the expense of at least 1,800 new visas being created for yoga instructors, curry chefs, and musicians. Because Britain was in dire shortage of New Delhi's Vindaloo street vendors, of course. Never mind the fact that Wetherspoons is actually the most popular curry vendor in the country, which means that Brits aren't too keen on the authenticity of their Indian food. Though chicken tikka masala was invented in Britain, so there you go. We have the recipe. We don't need any more. What this is, of course, is a move by India's Hindutva regime, led by Prime Minister Modi, that is very, very smart. Because they've been waiting for years to negotiate this deal. They were told no by Suella Braverman, and I have it on good authority that Liz Truss also rebuffed them, despite the Guardian reporting at the time saying that she was going to cave ahead of Conservative Party conference. Even Rishi Sunak didn't have time to squish on more Indian visas, despite importing hundreds of thousands of them and writing a paper in 2014 saying that the then Conservative government should also import hundreds of thousands of them.
You look beneath the slightly alarmist headlines here, you can see what they're trying to do. Indians, it decides, are hard-working and much more likely to vote Tory or Conservative. Africans, however, it concludes, are much more likely to vote for the Labour Party, but are also much more likely to be unemployed. The report author says the intention wasn't to raise an alarm about mass migration, but to help politicians better understand a changing electorate.
We examined socioeconomic status, life experiences, attitudes and aspirations, and what we found is on almost any metric you look at, there are striking differences between communities, and it would be good for politicians and policymakers to appreciate.
He didn't have time to do that and sell us out because he called the election early. But Keir Starmer, don't worry, he's backing British workers by raising national insurance contributions on British workers, and then exempting Indians on work visas from those national insurance contributions for 3 years, making it easier and cheaper for firms with an Indian headquarters. That includes many IT firms, but also car companies like Jaguar. By their latest advert, you'd think that their headquarters was stationed on some transsexual planet in the backwater galaxy, some sort of like Star Wars cantina or something, but by the by, in India, so it makes it easier for companies with Indian headquarters to import Indian workers. And so he sent the incentive pressures for British workers to be yet again uncut by cheap foreign labour. And so the insinuation that he's backing British workers while doing this, and while also enabling Modi to import people on spurious visas, like, musicians and yoga instructors, because what they do is they foster an Indian diaspora, they increase the presence of traditional Indian culture, and therefore they create these cultural and demographic diasporas in Britain who, thanks to the 1948 British Nationality Act, can vote in our elections as Commonwealth citizens, to then leverage demographics into democratic pressure on behalf of the Indian government overseas. And we know this is the case because former Home Secretary Priti Patel in a Foreign Affairs Select Committee meeting once used Modi's quote, living bridges, to describe India diaspora communities. Where's the bridge from? Well, wherever they're living, back to the homeland. And so there's this permeable barrier of support for the Indian nation that can then translate into client voting blocs exerting pressure on Britain's democracies.
Do you think, you've mentioned Prime Minister Modi a couple of times, he is the architect of the term living bridge. and effectively usage of, the diaspora community around the world, the Indian diaspora, not just in the UK but more broadly, has really helped to strengthen ties with key countries. Do you think our own Prime Minister understands the significance of the Living Bridge and why domestically the diaspora communities matter when it comes to bilateral relationships?
While the native host British population vote on individual lines, they don't have much of a collective consciousness, they vote based on issues. These imported sectarian satellite communities like Pakistani Muslims or Indian Hindus and Sikhs will tell candidates to sign up to their manifestos or hold struggle sessions in mosques in order to win over their vote. And so Modi knows this. He's an intelligent operator, don't get me wrong, and Keir Starmer has just delivered him this license to further leverage pressure on British democracy. So, same time he's saying, Keir Starmer, that we're rolling back the post-Brexit Boris wave experiment, the one nation experiment and open borders, as he says, he's donning his lab coat and continuing the experiment. Now, you can judge his measures for yourself as to whether or not he is reversing this betrayal, because the following measures were announced in their immigration white paper. Skilled workers must now provide proof of university degree level qualifications or their equivalent, and the salary threshold is going to be raised to an unspecified amount, with the immigration salary list that exempts some people from thresholds being abolished. Now, this is a rectification from the points-based system that Boris Johnson and Priti Patel introduced when, maddeningly, they set the skilled worker visa salary threshold to less than the national median wage at £31,461. That was the median wage at the time. They set it to something around 25,000 and lower than the national minimum wage of 20,000, and they set it at £17,920 for new entrants. So you could earn less than the annual minimum wage and come in on a skilled worker visa. And these skills include working for barbershops, kebab shops, mobile phone technicians. It's why you've got endless numbers of mobile phone repair shops, kebab vendors and vape shops now on your high street after COVID absolutely desolated small businesses that were owned by families or even large chains in the UK. And they also were allowed to bring limitless numbers of dependents. Now that's going to be cut, as is the entire visa for the health and social care sector. It's going to be eliminated because they have imported thousands of these visas, right? Between 2021 and 2024, the former government imported 269,999 people on these visas. They were outnumbered, sometimes 10-1 among Zimbabweans. I think it was 4-1 by Nigerians and 2-1 by Ghanaians. They were outnumbered by their dependents, 377,135 dependents. And all of these people, both the workers and the dependents, were net drains on the taxpayer because the health and social care visa is paid for by the taxpayer from the NHS. And also, their wages have been significantly diminished over time, meaning that they are never going to be net taxpayers. And so they're taking more out of public services than they put in. And all of their dependents are never contributing positively to taxes over their lifetime, usually. If you look at data from Denmark and the Netherlands, from people from Africa, North Africa specifically, Middle East, Pakistan, and Turkey, all of these people are never going to be positive taxpayer contributors, so they're just draining the taxpayer of their funds, and they cost about £465,000 each by the age of 81, but that's if they enter the country age 25 and they work. If they're born here and repeat the economic patterns of their parents, they're a net drain across their lifetime. So this is going to be cut. However, no word on the millions of people that have come here since 2021 that are draining the taxpayer being encouraged to return home. This white paper doesn't cover that. But positive, they've cut the health and social care visa, credit where it's due. Those who've arrived legally on work, study or visitor visas from countries including Pakistan, Nigeria and Sri Lanka will no longer be able to apply for asylum. Now, you might be scratching your head as to why someone on a legal visa would be able to apply for asylum in the first place. Well, it turns out 40,000 people did that in 2024. 47% of that, curiously, were students who were nearing the end of their visa. So they just so happened to have realised, hey, I need asylum, as they were about to either finish their degree or they dropped out and were unable to stay in the country because they hadn't found a job within 2 years. By the way, that requirement to leave the country once you found a degree if you don't have a job, that was implemented by the Theresa May government, was repealed by Boris Johnson's government. So students can just mill about for years after they've finished their degree, doing absolutely nothing and leeching off the taxpayer, maybe occasionally entering the Deliveroo economy. This is why Neil O'Brien and Robert Jenrick, in their Centre for Policy Studies report, coined the term Deliveroo degree, because usually what happens is they will come over on these one-year master's degrees that low-rent universities will dole out, and then the government picks up the tab for the promised student loans that international students pay at an increased rate, and then they just drop off the radar, disappear into the system, and cycle around making a few £100 tax-free, again taking more from the taxpayer than they pay in, and usually living in houses of multiple occupancy thanks to some shady deals by some landlords. Apparently, that's going to be ended again. What about all the people granted asylum on those spurious grounds in the last few years? Are they going to be returned home, or is the asylum system just yet another migration system? It's not about temporary stays for the needy, it's just about permanent settlement in Britain to disappear into the system and leech off of my and your taxpayers' expense. Another thing, the ability for foreign students to remain in Britain after their graduation will be reduced from 2 years to 18 months. Whoop-de-doo, a whole 6 months for them to continue to not have work and wander about Britain's streets, taking from your and my pocket. Just disallow them if they don't have a job, like it was in 2017. Perfectly reasonable measure to do. The number of occupations on the temporary shortage list for work visas will be reduced, and the ability to bring dependents restricted. Details have not been published on by what and how, but it just says it's reduced and restricted. Let's hope that there's a positive move there, but as you're seeing in this paper, there's a lot of vagueness, there's a lot of, well, we'll discuss the details at a later date. It's not really good enough, is it? And that's why the estimates for how much this will bring migration down have a lot of question marks around it. The standard qualifying period for indefinite leave to remain, and this is an important one, well done to Carl Williams and Sam Bidwell for making this an issue. The qualifying period for receiving ILR settlements, which means that you can stay in the UK indefinitely, has been moved from 5 years to now 10 years. So you have to be in the country for at least 10 years before you are legally entitled to claim social housing, benefits, use the NHS for free at the point of use. After a certain number of years of national insurance contributions, you can claim the full state pension, that you have a fast track to gaining British citizenship for both you and your dependents. All of those privileges, all of those expensive benefits afforded to foreign nationals will now have a 5-year delay slapped on them, which is something, as Sam Bidwell has just provided for the Home Secretary to sign, ready-made. It's something that Yvette Cooper could have always done with a stroke of a Whitehall pen, and it's something that every single Conservative Home Secretary could have done. But I happen to know that, according to Boris Johnson's team at the time, they had absolutely no idea this existed when they took all the caps and time restraints off of visas in 2021 for their new points-based system. They didn't even know this was a thing. So that is how woefully unprepared these people were to govern, despite promising to take back control, which meant to every single Brexit voter, or at least the vast majority for whom immigration was the chief concern, to reduce migration, to stop illegal migration, to encourage non-contributors and those who are unwilling to abide by our laws and assimilate to our culture, encouraging those people to return to their countries of origin and stop bothering us.
Immigration policy must be not just about who comes here, but about who we decide must leave. People here on time-limited visas must be told to go. People who refuse to accept our culture and way of life must leave, and people who have broken the law and those who take out less than they put in must be thrown out. We're going to need to ensure vast numbers of removals and deportations in the years ahead. And we need to remove the legal impediments in domestic law and in international conventions drafted in another age that stop us securing the border and saving our country. And we must be tough about who we allow to come here. We cannot afford to import more of the world's hatreds, nor allow foreign conflicts to be fought out on our streets. We must accept that not every migrant is the same and not every culture is equal. 1 in 50 Albanians in Britain is in jail. 1 in 3 Pakistani and Bangladeshi heritage adults is economically inactive. 72% of Somalis live in social housing. We are a million miles away from doing what is necessary.
And speaking of assimilation, One of the requirements that's been slapped on, and this is very interesting, is fluency in English is now a requirement for all visa holders and their dependents. So you cannot come over, at least on paper, if you cannot speak English. Now, this is very curious, because this follows a long campaign by former Reform UK, now independent MP Rupert Lowe, who has been banging the drum on the cost of translation services since he's been elected to Parliament, firing off his daily allowance of parliamentary questions to procure the costs for us. So he found that in 2023, the NHS, National Health Service, spent £100 million on translation services, the job centres spent £3,420,480, and the Department of Work and Pensions decided to translate their calls into 115 languages at the cost of £7.2 million to explain to Britain's 500,000 foreign-born population occupying social housing how they can claim even more of our benefits. Did you know, for example, £7.5 billion every year is spent on benefits to those born abroad? Why are you here? If you're not contributing anything of worth to this country, go home. Rebuild your own country. It's funny how we're constantly told that Britain was simultaneously built by diversity, which Keir Starmer says in this speech, by the way, while also, if diversity is an unalloyed good, why are you stopping more of it coming in? Doesn't make any sense. But it's built by diversity. Without it, we'd be nothing. It is enrichment, but also we have to bear the costs of untold numbers of third worlders coming into our country. And when you complain about it, it's actually a punishment for your past sins of racism, colonialism, slavery, and empire. So diversity is both our strength, and you deserve diversity because someone in your past was an evil racist, probably. It's a strength, and it's a punishment. The contradiction is the point. They're just trying to win. They are not trying to be consistent. They're just trying to force their agenda through, which is both ideological and often ethnically resentful, at any and all costs. And they're just pushing at whichever angle they think will have you submit and be silent, as you have to front the cost for this policy that absolutely nobody asked for and have voted against in every election since 1974. But point being, this insistence that everyone who comes here must speak English came from the very online right and Rupert Lowe. And only a few months ago, Rupert Lowe was on BBC Politics Live telling literally a communist, Ash Sarkar, I don't care, they should speak English and that all translation services should be scrapped. And he was being screeched at on taxpayer-funded television.
So the first thing is that when it comes to things like translations, that's so patients can access healthcare. It's the job of the NHS.
If they can't speak English, Ash, they should.
Wait. Did I interrupt you? Rupert, did I interrupt you? No, I didn't.
I'm sorry, we don't need
translation. No. Wait.
Let
me finish, all right? The NHS exists to provide the best possible care to patients. Now, some of those patients will feel more comfortable speaking in their native language.
I don't care.
Right?
I have no interest in that.
Well, fine.
They should speak English. They live in England, they should speak English.
Well, it's gone from the domain of the very online right to Labour Party policy in less than a year. So, guess another win up on the board for the very online right. As Ash Sarkar would say, we're winning, lads. Also, final point. Ministers will bring forward legislation, apparently, to amend the Immigration Acts of 2002 and 2014 to redefine what exceptional circumstances are as they pertain to asylum applicants appealing to Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the right to a family life. These are often the appeals that frustrate Home Office deportation orders. The most egregious examples are Zimbabwean and Pakistani paedophiles claiming a right to a family life, or an Albanian criminal and illegal migrant saying that he can't leave the country because his family would have to go with him and his son is autistic and a picky eater and he doesn't like foreign chicken nuggets, therefore he gets to stay. The problem with this, as you will anticipate, is that without leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, we are still subject to Article 46 rulings by the European Court of Human Rights. So if these judges, one, don't adhere to the new laws and guidance that say exceptional circumstances is very narrowly defined, and why would they? Because Keir Starmer himself wrote the textbook on how to apply Tony Blair's 1998 Human Rights Act for judges, which codified the supremacy of the European Court and Convention on Human Rights into UK law, then this gets pushed up to the European Court of Human Rights, who can issue an Article 46 ruling and supersede UK law. And Keir Starmer will never leave the convention and the jurisdiction of the court because he loves his international law, and so his back will be up against the wall and nothing will be done. So a lot of this is just for show. Now, bear in mind, the Conservatives committed to doing the same thing, by the way. They won't leave the ECHR. They've just said that they want to legislate so that the ECHR, both the court and convention, and the Human Rights Act will not apply to immigration cases. Again, you will still be subject to Article 46 rulings, so the likelihood of that working will be low. But it is important to note that the Conservatives have basically had their lunch eaten by this, and that's the real motivation for these changes, isn't it? The Labour Party just lost 187 seats at the local election. Reform became the largest party in the country with 677 seats. A couple of those are resigned, but they're still the most dominant. Labour lost their only council. Reform gained about 10. They are quaking in their boots, and they know that 2/3 of Reform's voters had their chief issue as immigration, both legal and illegal. So they know that they need to be seen to be doing things on this. They've received advice from Blair, no doubt, to try and contain the growth of an insurgent populist party that is almost solely single issue on migration, and so they're trying to cut Reform off at the knees by dealing with legal and illegal migration. However, when the chips are down, they're not going to put up enough of a fight because they're still constrained by these legal frameworks and these laws that were passed by their predecessor and mentor, Tony Blair. And the Conservative Party have so sufficiently remade themselves in Blair's image that they can't quite escape the confines of that Cameron-Blairite paradigm. They're still trying to be cautious, and they're trying to depict their unwillingness to move rapidly and enact necessary revolutionary change. As Robert Jenrick has suggested with the Great Repeal Bill, Kemi Badenoch is trying to refashion that as being the sensible, policy-focused adult in the room. Well, this should be a lesson on how quickly you can have your lunch eaten if you practice an abundance of caution in an age where politics is dictated by social media. And I say it's dictated by social media. See again the fact that the very online right and Rupert Lowe were pushing an English language requirement on Twitter only about 6 months ago, and it's now Labour Party policy. But, and here's where the betrayal comes in, it's not just the India deal. Hidden away in the deal, as Robert Jenrick has also cottoned on to a couple of hours after I did on Twitter, hidden away in this white paper is a plan to, quote, explore reforms to allow a limited pool of UNHCR recognised refugees and displaced people living overseas to apply for employment through our existing sponsored worker routes where they have the skills to do so. In short, they plan to allow asylum seekers who've applied from overseas the right to work in Britain. So that means that, let's say, the kinds of refugee camps, if you want to call them that Shamima Begum, the ISIS bride, was milling about in Syria, if someone says, well, sorry, I'm qualified as a brain surgeon, don't ask questions about the veracity of my qualification, you know, all those top universities in Syria, I can come over to the UK and receive indefinite leave to remain, and the right to settle, and the right to claim benefits and all that. What happens when this precedent is applied to 123 million people that the UNHCR recognises as eligible refugees around the world? And what happens when this precedent comes into conflict with the new proposed changes to the Human Rights Act and the application of the European Convention on Human Rights? Because remember, we are still signed up to the 1952 Refugee Convention, and so if we withdraw the Human Rights Act 1998, if we withdraw from the European Court and Convention on Human Rights, then we will still be beholden to the UN Refugee Convention, which defines a refugee as anyone unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin. Now, I just don't feel like it. It's a bit rubbish, isn't it? So what happens when that becomes the legal statute that then illegal migrants in Britain can appeal to? Does that create a pull factor for more men to pay people smugglers to ferry them across the English Channel? Because we've already seen the Telegraph reporting that men are earning about £500 a week from asylum hotels and accommodation in London, working as Deliveroo drivers and taking unlicensed income without paying any tax. Won't it just become even more appealing for these men to break the law and enter our country if, while they're waiting for their asylum decision, they can work in any profession they so choose, especially if they have family members over here, and especially if shady businesses like the aforementioned vape or even PAWN, porn, shops, are engaging in Hawaladar finance to facilitate the global Muslim trafficking trade. So all of these are a hidden and underhanded way of actually increasing immigration in the long term. So in his speech last November, Starmer, if you remember, said Brexit was used for that purpose, to turn Britain into a one-nation experiment in open borders. And he reiterated that on Monday's speech. And he said, until in 2023, immigration reached nearly 1 million, which is about the population of Birmingham, our second largest city, and probably our ugliest. That's not control, it's chaos. And look, they must answer for themselves, but I don't think you can do something like that by accident. It was a choice made, even as they told the country they were doing the opposite. A one-nation experiment in open borders conducted on a country that voted for control. Well, no more. This government is shutting down the lab. The experiment is over. We will deliver what you have asked for time and time again, and we will take back control of our borders. Well, will they? Because Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick has pointed out these measures might only cut net migration by a meagre 500,000. Home Office estimates have said they will reduce the number of foreign workers and students coming by 98,000 every year, which is encouraging. But if you remember, in 2023, net migration peaked at 906,000 people. It was total gross, about 1.22 million. That fell to just over 700,000 for 2024. And so if it's going to come down, then it's only going to be about 500,000 to 600,000 as of next year. Only, that's still double the rate of pre-Brexit migration. And migration was the reason that people voted for Brexit in the first place. Now, Professor Brian Bell is the chairman of the Migration Advisory Committee, that quango who's very pro-migration, but who told Boris Johnson, I wouldn't do the care worker visa if I were you. So Boris Johnson actually went against the advice of the Migration Advisory Committee and created the Boris Wave. Well, Brian Bell, who's the chairman, said that the white paper could cause net migration to fall to under 300,000, probably closer to 250,000 in the next few years. But this seems to contradict new modelling by Home Office insiders who have said that contrary to the Office of Budget Responsibility, OBR's modelling that was erroneous by a factor of 2 to 3 in recent years, that said net migration will be 315,000 to 400,000, they said, actually, net migration is going to be a new normal, a new minimum of 525,000 every year. Who voted for this? Nobody wants this. There is no democratic mandate for this, except within the pro-immigration bubble of SW1. And the perfect quote, which sums this up, is in David Goodhart's Road to Somewhere. The Anywhere class, a sort of transitory, bleeding heart liberals of the global international order, who Keir Starmer represents, the civil services in an ill-fitting suit, who says he prefers Davos to Westminster. Well, David Goodhart in 2010 was having dinner in Oxford with a chap called Gus O'Donnell, and he was the cabinet secretary under Blair and Brown, a little bit of Cameron, if I remember correctly. And David Goodhart said he was writing this book about national identity, belonging, and the impact of immigration on the working class versus the rootless metropolitan political elite class who are very detached from the concerns of those they govern. Gus O'Donnell said, when I was at the Treasury, I pushed for the most open doors migration policy possible because I believe my commitment was to global welfare above anything else. They see the world as Britain's in waiting and Britain as the world's poor box to dish out international aid or even benefits inside their country if they can pack us to the rafters with foreign workers and their dependents as means of restitution for us somehow causing poverty or once having done slavery despite going on an international crusade to vanquish it, or doing horrible things with the British Empire like preventing bride burning in India, or the ritualistic sacrifice of children in South America, if the Spanish Empire is to be included in this. They basically see the broader West as guilty of the original sin of racism, and so we have to subject our increasingly squeezed productive working and middle classes to higher taxes to redistribute to foreign chancellors who cross the channel using people smugglers, or one of millions of recipients of the rubber-stamped visas that is only limited in admission by the physical size of the Home Office building and the number of desks they can fit in it. Now, new net migration figures are due to be released on the 22nd of May, so people are kind of bracing themselves for the real numbers for this year, because of course Keir Starmer will be culpable for everything since July, so I wonder if we'll see headlines about a new Starmer wave happening. And he insisted during his speech, and this is the key part, that he's doing this because it is right, it is fair, and it's because it is what I believe in. Excuse me if I don't believe that, because during the announcement, he couldn't help himself but peddle in the fiction that diversity built Britain.
And look, I mean, migration is part of Britain's national story. We talked last week about the great rebuilding of this country after the war. Migrants were part of that, and they make a massive contribution today. And you will never hear me denigrate that.
Note the sole example in that clip that Keir Starmer gave was the HMT Windrush. We've had a lot of this myth-making about the Windrush generation ever since the Macpherson report accused the Met Police of institutional racism, and they treat the Windrush generation like the settlers who showed up to blitz destroyed Britain and rebuilt it like they were the pilgrims of Plymouth Rock in America. Actually, when the Windrush docked at Tilbury Dock in 1948, people were shocked because they hadn't been encouraged over by the government. They'd been encouraged over with the promise of well-paying bus conductor jobs by adverts by bus companies who were selling tickets on the Windrush cheap. And so the British government just had to sort of ad hoc accommodate all of these people that had showed up as citizens of the Commonwealth. And look, it doesn't mean they're all bad people. It just means that they were acting in their own economic interest. Okay? That doesn't mean they rebuilt Britain out of the kindness of their hearts. They didn't do it necessarily at their expense. They did it in better conditions, albeit more windswept than sunny Caribbean, than where they were living beforehand. So they benefited from this, not the other way around. And look, if Starmer's going to use the Windrush to argue that we are, in Britain, a history of one unbroken chain of waves of migration, he's going to have to explain why we have received more migrants since the election of his predecessor, Tony Blair, in 1997 to now, than we did between the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and the end of the Second World War in 1945. He's also going to have to explain, if he does believe that, why, as was absurdly put forward in a recent debate with Renaud Camus on Unheard, the Viking invaders and the Norman conquests count as migrants. If they're in the same category as Windrush or the Boris Wave, well, I might see it that way, in many respects. Critics of mass migration might see it that way, but it's not the best sales pitch for the advocates of diversity being our strength. So, what's next? Well, the Conservatives are largely irrelevant now. They're going to have to race to catch up with Labour, ironically, because Kemi Badenoch, as I mentioned, said that she was going to disbar the application of the ECHR and Human Rights Act to immigration cases. Well, they might still have a case to do so if Starmer's legislation isn't strong enough and doesn't go through, so they might need to press on that, but it seems that Starmer has already reached, even exceeded in some cases, their promise of what to do at the next election. They also pledged to extend the indefinite leave to remain settlement to 10 years instead of 5. Now, they were advised by Sam Bidwell to do 15 years and to restrict the number of countries eligible for indefinite leave to remain to those most likely to be culturally compatible with Britain and making economic contributions. Now, they did restrict it to individuals who made positive tax contributions and to ensure that neither they nor their dependents were a net drain on the taxpayer, that none of them had committed crimes and none of them had entered illegally, so you would never be eligible for indefinite leave to remain, even if your asylum application was accepted, which means you are open for deportation at any time. But Labour have already beaten them to the punch on that. So again, they need to shore up their ability to provide an alternative to Labour at the next election. The problem they have, though, is anyone can say 14 years, or Boris Wave, or why didn't you do this when you were in government, to immediately discredit them as the people able to carry out immigration restriction and mass deportations. But the fact that CCHQ have been ignoring their advisors who have said, don't race after reform to the right, and have been tweeting out videos of Nigel Farage formally denouncing mass deportations to position themselves as the party who will conduct the removal of every illegal immigrant in the country, shows you the direction of travel for British politics more broadly, as does this Labour announcement. Well, where are reform? That's a curious question, isn't it? Reform have gone from Nigel Farage telling Stephen Edgington last year that mass deportations are a political impossibility and not his ambition, to a week out from the local elections, announcing that a reform government will appoint a minister for deportations. They will leave the ECHR, They will repeal the Human Rights Act. They will repeal the Equality Act, despite appealing to it in their legal action against Rupert Lowe. And they will expedite the removal of every single illegal immigrant residing in Britain, who either came on a small boat or seemingly came under false pretenses, overstayed a visa, which would amount to at least 1.2 million by 2017, according to Pew Research, and another 220,000 who have crossed since 2018. And of course, it's only going up. There's been an 86% increase in small boat crossings since 2023. So there's going to be even more of them here, enticed by Keir Starmer's permissive asylum policy in the next few years until the general election in 2029. Now, Richard Tice half-joked, on Camilla Tominey's show last week on GB News that he would take a lead from Governor Greg Abbott and Governor Ron DeSantis, and after Reform UK closed down the asylum accommodation centres and hotels in the first 100 days, using a pro bono lawyer to conduct legal action in their new council districts, that they are going to helpfully redistribute all of these illegal migrants and asylum applicants in areas that might be happier to accommodate them. You know, Lib Dem, Green, even Labour areas, though maybe not after the latest announcement. He said it with a wry smile, but I think it's actually a good optical idea. But it's an idea governed by the fact that the very online right, and therefore the broader British public, will like it. So you can't afford to disparage this as Farage once did, dark and dangerous use of rhetoric, when 99%, when polled, of your own voters expect the policy and support it. And when it's mentioned at your conference by me, it's met with rapturous applause. You can't afford to do so, and you can't afford to say that there's some clean distinction between social media and the real world anymore, because pretty much everyone, or at least everyone is related to, someone who spends an awful lot of time online and an awful lot of time on Musk's Twitter specifically. So there's now a permeable barrier between what is online and what is in the real world. And also, politicians' perceptions are heavily shaped by social media, and they know this, which is why they try and shape the perceptions in turn on social media. See the mass panic about adolescence, for example, or the fact that they're so obsessed with controlling social media with online safety acts and emergency legislation. So I would just say, pay attention to what the online right is saying about substantive immigration policy, not the mass expulsion of everyone from Britain who is a darker shade than milk, because I'm not advocating for that. Nobody who actually cares about policy is advocating for that. I think a lot of that is actually driven by central government psyops who want to discredit the movement more broadly. Pay attention to the specific issues, like indefinite leave to remain, that have been raised by the online right, and see which direction they go in next, because they are the minesweepers for the Overton window. And Reform are currently occupying that space. Rupert Lowe beat them to the punch. The Conservatives are sprinting now to catch up to Keir Starmer, who is out of breath, but who has reached broadly the same position as the party most likely to enter government as of 2029. And it's interesting that Rupert Lowe, pay attention to him, is now forming a motion in Parliament for the mass deportation of illegal migrants, and he's got 9 co-sponsors. These include a bunch of Conservative MPs, that's Jack Rankin, Peter Bedford, 2 Northern Irish MPs, Jim Allister, Carla Lockhart, and Alex Easton, an independent MP, and a couple of other Conservative MPs that signed on to it as well. Andrew Rosendale, Lewis Cocking, Sir Gavin Williamson, and John Lamont. None of the big Conservative heavy hitters that you'd expect that are in the shadow cabinet, like Katie Lamb or Robert Jenrick, perhaps because they've been told not to, but I know that they support it in spirit. So that means if the Conservative Party and various other parties are now racing up to align with Rupert Lowe's positions, and Rupert Lowe's positions are apparently synonymous with the online rights positions, well, it turns out that Labour, Conservatives, Reform, everyone's reached the position of the online right. Everyone's doing mass deportations now.